You ever feel like you're trying to navigate a stock market, but for attraction? I mean, one day someone's interest in you is soaring, right? And the next, it just plummets for no reason you can figure out. It feels so volatile, so confusing, and honestly, completely irrational. Well, what if that isn't just a feeling? What if attraction really does operate like its own kind of stock market? Let's dive into that idea.
Yeah, this is the question that trips almost all of us up, isn't it? We try to be logical. We make our little lists of qualities we want in a person, we think about shared values, all the sensible stuff. And then bam, we find ourselves completely hooked on someone who makes zero logical sense. Or, just as weirdly, we suddenly lose interest in someone who, well, they check all the boxes. It's so frustrating, right? It really feels like there are these hidden rules to the game that nobody ever told us about.
And really, here's the core conflict, right? On one side, you've got what we think we want, that sensible, stable foundation, the shared values, the deep connection. But then there's the reality. And reality often feels a lot more like a wild roller coaster, one that's driven by hype, perception, and these sudden, crazy changes. That disconnect, that's what leaves us feeling so lost. It's like we're playing a game, but we were never handed the rule book. Okay, so let's properly explore this framework. Let's call it love on the market. Think of it as a lens, a way to understand how our feelings can swing up and down just as dramatically as stock prices, and often for very, very similar and very human reasons. Okay, think about a hot stock in the actual market. Is it always the best, most stable company? Heck no. A lot of the time, it's just the one everyone's talking about, the one with all the hype and the perceived potential. Well, it's the exact same principle here. A person's attraction stock can soar or crash based on social proof and perception, and sometimes that has almost nothing to do with their actual fundamental qualities. And all of this really leads us to something we can call the perception principle. This is the psychological engine that drives this whole emotional market. It's the why behind our feelings seeming to change on a dime. So, at the very heart of this principle is what we're going to call emotional investment. This is the actual currency we're all trading with. It's our time, our energy, our feelings, our vulnerability. And just like a real investor, we're way more willing to put those precious resources into someone whose value we perceive as being high, or even better, on the rise. And this whole thing happens like a chain reaction. It's pretty wild. First, you get the perception of high demand. So we see that other people want this person's time and attention. Boom. That simple perception automatically boosts their value in our eyes. And what happens next? Well, as a direct result, our own willingness to invest emotionally shoots up. Suddenly, we want in on the action.
Really, it all boils down to this. It's not about your intrinsic value, it's about your perceived value. Now, look, in this emotional marketplace, who you really are, your kindness, your humor, your intelligence, of course that still matters. But it's always, always being filtered through the lens of perception. Your market value is ultimately determined by what other people believe it is. And yeah, that can be a tough pill to swallow. But wow, it explains so much, doesn't it? All right, so if perception is the spark, then what's the fuel for the fire? Well, it's that classic economic principle we all learned about, just applied to people: psychological supply and demand. This is what powers the entire market. And I know we've all felt this. Picture this. There's someone, maybe a friend or an acquaintance, who's just always been around. You're not really interested. But then, all of a sudden, they get into a serious relationship. Or maybe they're moving away. They become scarce. And what happens? You find yourself thinking, wait a second, did I miss something here? Just like that, their stocks soared because the supply of their attention just went way, way down. So this basically gives us a few key market scenarios. Let's look at this. If someone is highly desired, that's high demand, but they also seem kind of hard to get, that's low supply, their attraction stock just skyrockets. That's the sweet spot, right? But on the flip side, if someone is always available, high supply, but nobody else seems to be interested, low demand, their stock pretty much crashes. I know, it's a brutal model when you lay it out like this, but it explains those confusing emotional shifts with pretty surprising accuracy. Okay, so this is all a pretty fascinating theory, right? But what does it actually mean for you, for us? How do we take this idea and use it to manage our own emotional portfolio in this, frankly, chaotic market? So, what are the big takeaways here? The most important thing, I think, is to stop seeing attraction as this fixed thing that someone either has or doesn't. It's not. It's a dynamic system. It's always changing. This means you got to recognize the huge power of perceived demand
And know that it's not a personal failing on your part if you feel it, it's a totally normal psychological pull. Also, it's so important to be aware of how scarcity can mess with your judgment, how it can make you overvalue something just because it's unavailable. Look, the goal here isn't to learn how to manipulate the market. It's about understanding the rules so you can navigate your own feelings with a lot more clarity and maybe, just maybe, a little less frustration.
So I'll leave you with this one last thought. As you move through your own personal emotional market, think about your role in it. Are you the investor, constantly reacting to the perceived value of everyone else? Or are you the stock, mindful of your own perceived supply and demand? Something to chew on. Maybe the real secret to navigating all this is learning how to be a little bit of both.